All right, Megan, I got 1 Eastern. Is it okay if I go ahead and get this party started officially?
Absolutely.
All right, awesome. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. And if you're watching this as a recording, I hope you're having a good day, no matter when and where you are, because we are here to talk about grant attachments, best practices in grant attachments, because attachments are where it's at. That's right. So if you are here for that, you're in the right place. I'm excited for this one. I've been looking forward to it for many months. Welcome to all of you. I'm Steven. I'm over here at Bloomerang, and I'll be moderating today's discussion as always. And just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Just want to let you all know that we are recording this presentation. We'll be sending the recording as well as the slides later on this afternoon. So be on the lookout for that. If you have to leave early, or maybe you got another appointment, maybe you get interrupted, or just want to share it with a friend or a colleague, you'll be able to do that. Just look for an email from Bloomerang later on today with all those goodies. And most importantly, we love for these sessions to be interactive. So use that chat box. I know a lot of you already have. Say hi, introduce yourself. I love that. Thank you to all of you who have done that. But also send your questions our way. We're going to save a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So send in those questions. Don't be shy. There's a Q&A box and a chat box. If you use the Q&A box, that might be a little more visible to us. But bottom line is we would love to hear from you over the next hour or so. And if this is your first Bloomerang webinar, welcome. We do these webinars every single Thursday throughout the year, literally like 50 sessions a year. We love it. One of our favorite things we do here at Bloomerang. If you've never heard of Bloomerang, we are also a provider of donor management software. That's what Bloomerang is. So check us out if you are interested, or if you're in the market for software. Pretty easy to find online, and you can watch tons of videos and get to know us. So check us out if you are interested. Don't do that right now, because you all are in for a real treat. We've got a true grant attachments expert joining us from beautiful Denver, Colorado, Megan Ferry. Megan, how you doing? You doing okay?
Definitely.
This is awesome to have you. We've been talking about this session. I'm so glad that it's finally here. We were talking earlier. This is one we have never covered in 10 years of Bloomerang webinars, which I feel ashamed of, but we are righting that wrong in a really big way, having Megan join us. If you all don't know Megan, she is awesome. She's got many, many years, over 15 years of experience in all kinds of roles, but specifically grant writing. She's been in your shoes. She's been a development director. She's been an ED, and has raised a lot of money doing this. Very active in the Colorado community, the AFP chapter there, of course, and has a degree from the Lilly School family, my backyard in Indianapolis and Bloomington, Indiana. So love that. So Megan, you're awesome. Nobody wants to hear from me. They want to hear from you. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll let you bring up your slides here to talk all about attachments. Let's see if it works.
Okay, let me make sure.
It's always the fun transition.
Yes. Okay. Can you see them, Steven?
It looks like it's working. Take it away, my friend.
Okay, well, I guess the countdown to webinar is over. So thank you all today who are joining. Like Steven said, if you're viewing this as a recording, hopefully you're having a lovely day as well. Just so you all know, in the chat, we're a team. The nonprofit Navigators are a team of 9 amazing women, and they are on the webinar today too. Feel free to ask questions in chat. Steven is gonna pull up any that are big or that a lot of people ask, but Laura and others on our team are there in the chat and are happy to address questions in the chat. So, and I'm sure there's other grant experts as well. And it's always, basically, I'm sure there's lots of knowledge and advice in the chat. So please use it and keep moving forward. So anyway, my name is, oh wait, sorry. That's not where we are yet. Okay. Why isn't this moving, Steven? Okay. There we go. Attachments are where it's at. That's where we are today. And we wanted to talk about grant attachments. A lot of people think about grant writing and think about the actual writing, which is incredibly important. However, there's also the attachment side, is equally important, and we'll get into the details of it. But basically, we find that nonprofits and others in this field sometimes don't know what's asked for attachments, what to provide in which case, how important they are, where you could have beautiful, wonderful language, but if your budget doesn't make sense, you're going to be a no. So we'll get into the details on that. Stephen introduced me. My name is Megan Ferry. I did live in Indianapolis and go to the Lilly School of Philanthropy. I also lived in Tempe, Arizona. For anyone that is coming from Arizona, I heard some cactus flowers. I currently reside on the west side of Denver, Colorado. Love it. Been here for 15 years, and basically most of my professional career has been here. Just a fun factoid, I'm actually a military brat, so I think it's 11 states and 2 foreign countries. So anyway, from everywhere. Nonprofit net. I work with a group of, like I said, 9 amazing women. We map success for nonprofits with grant writing, consulting. We primarily work in Colorado and Alabama, but all over the nation as well. Our vision is to see every nonprofit well-funded and serving their clients in measurably effective ways for the benefit of the community. Highly recommend the group, not just because I work there, because they're wonderful, but if nothing else, hopefully can enjoy the picture of Colorado wildflowers, which in those mountains, they're going to bloom in June. So we're not going to see those flowers yet. So for the grant attachments today, just so you all know, my experience and the focus of this webinar is foundation grants and primarily US nonprofits. I have very little experience outside of the country. That doesn't mean this isn't relevant for our Canadian and South African and other people that are on here. But just so you know, this is with a US lens. And again, like I said, most of my experience is in Colorado. We have people all over the country that have contributed to this webinar. So it is not specific just to Colorado, but I want to let you know that that's where my background is. And this information is also useful for government grants. It's not the focus of this webinar, but government grants have attachments. I'm sure many people on the chat can weigh in. I think government grants is way harder for attachments. They ask for copies of your insurance policy, all sorts of random things. So anyway, just so you know, the focus is US Foundation grants. And for this webinar, excuse me, I'm assuming that you know what a grant is. This actually came about because I attended and some of my colleagues attended a webinar for Bloomerang in the fall. And I was thinking, where's step 2 in this? Like, here's a grant, here's common funders, here's how to find and what to do with grant language and make sure that you save it and all sorts of stuff. Really wonderful stuff. But where's the next step? Let's learn a little bit more about attachments. So if you're watching this as a recording and you're like, you know what, I don't know that much about grants, watch one of Bloomerang's past webinars on grants, watch somebody else's if you want. But basically for this webinar, I'm assuming that you know what a grant is. You may have literally helped with only written one grant, but you know what a grant is. So just so you know, as we're getting started. These learning objectives, we are going to talk about standard attachments that funders expect, what to include when there's an opportunity to upload optional attachments, and then what's trending right now. What are some different things we're hearing that are probably going to be important in 6 months or so. And before I get further down this webinar, I wanted to let you all know we're doing questions and answers at the end. We're going to take a pause as well after we go through some of the financial attachments, because sometimes people have a lot of questions on that. And sometimes it can be a bit difficult for, I shouldn't say difficult. It's a different way of thinking than language sometimes. So anyway, we're going to do 2 different Q&As is the point. Okay. As I was starting to say in the beginning of the webinar, the attachment should tell the same story as your narrative. If you say in your narrative that your budget has doubled because of COVID, you are seeing so much of an increase in food insecurity. There's all these people that have moved there to your town because of COVID, whatever it is. And that's just one example. Then your budget needs to say that. When I look at your 2020 financials, they should be half or less of what your 2021 financials are. So make sure that everything is telling the same story, whether it's your key staff list. If you mention a new executive director in your narrative and they're not on your key staff list, that's weird. So just be thinking that this is all part of the same story. Okay, woo, common attachments. I'm going to start easy to hard is what I think of this way. Other people might think it's different, but non-financial attachments, 501c3 letter. Most people on this webinar probably know exactly what that is and could send it to you this second if you needed it. But we're going to talk about that, the board of directors list, key staff list, and then we'll get into the financial attachments, your annual budget, program budgets, last year's financials, including your audit, Pnl and balance sheet, year-to-date financials, 990, and a major donor list. So we have a lot to cover. And as those who do grants know, sometimes every single one of these attachments is required. Sometimes you need 3 of them. Every grant is different. So for the 501c3 letter, here's an example. Again, this is a US tax IRS letter. So this is US information, but I'm guessing most states, or excuse me, most countries, I'm pretty sure Canada has a version of this. But basically you need to have this ready. Some funders want it dated within the last 5 years. It's very easy to ask for a new one. You call them, they send it to you within a couple months. But basically it is the document saying you are a 501c3 nonprofit. I'm not going to get into details on organizations that have a fiscal sponsorship, but basically just know if you are fiscally sponsored, there's going to be even more attachments, including the 501c3 letter for the group that holds your fiscal sponsorship. Board of directors list. We have an example board list here. You need names, what their job is, their job title, where they work, the city, and then their term. So this is an example with 3-year terms. These are all staggered, and some of them will be, well, one will be out. Professor Dumbledore will be leaving at the end of this year with his term. So just an example of what a board list should look like. Key staff list. Keep it short and sweet. Maybe 1 to 10 employees, depending on the size and structure. You do not need to list every single employee at your organization. List those who maybe are VPs or C-level. You decide what that looks like. Some organizations have $45 million budget, and so they have only their top staff. Some have a $500,000 budget and have 3 key staff members that they include. That's up to you. You have a short bio for each member, and make sure to include the year that the person started working or volunteering with the organization. So for example, for me, I could say that I started volunteering with my son's school 5 years ago, and I'm joining their board in 2022 or something. So you could have both if both are relevant, because it does matter how long a relationship is. So even if it isn't paid employment. Key staff lists. Now on to the financial attachments. Most of us get into nonprofit work because we love talking about money and we love math, right? I did. Well, not entirely of both of those, but I actually do have a math minor. So I like financials, I like numbers, I like budgets because they're very clear and they either add up or they don't. It's pretty simple. What goes into the budget is not simple. Deciding what you're going to do that year, all sorts of stuff. So this is, I would say this is the most important financial attachment, is your annual budget. Lots and lots of funders want to see, what are you projecting this year? 1 to 2 pages maximum. I once got a organization budget. This was a very large organization that was 100 pages. I'm sure they need that detail for certain things. A funder is not going to look at that. So everyone should be able to put their key revenue sources and expense sources in 1 to 2 pages. Include the dates. Perhaps it's January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2022. Maybe you have a July 1st fiscal year. So it's more based on the school year. That part is completely, like, each organization has their own fiscal year, but it's generally 12 months. 1 to 2 pages maximum. Include major categories and programs, including for revenues, like maybe it's foundations, individuals, corporations, events, Maybe you charge fees. Maybe you do mental health counseling. And so it's $100 an hour for many people. And then you do a subsidized sliding scale or something like that. So there, these are specific to your organization, but those are some really common revenue categories. On the expense side, you might have program 1, program 2, you might have 10 programs. I don't know. But then rent, insurance, computers, website, etc. All of these categories, many more. Some of you might say, well, why aren't salaries and benefits in there? They should be broken out by the different programs. Admin, maybe 20% of your executive director is spent on program 1, 20% on program 2, 20% on fundraising, and then 40% on admin. I don't know, but ideally you don't have one bucket that's just salaries and benefits. You're breaking it out by program, so it's easier when you're creating the program budgets. And then revenue should always be higher than expenses, ideally, but a zero-based budget is also okay. If you have a negative budget, you're going to have to explain that. And most of the time, if you have a negative budget, what people actually do is they say, we're bringing $50,000 from savings for whatever reason, and you can explain that later. And so it's not actually negative. My advice would be to not have a negative budget if at all possible, even if you are pulling from savings and it's strategic, and just put that as savings in your budget, and then you can explain it later. Program budgets. These should be updated annually for each program. Focus on expenses, including personnel. Some funders will ask for revenues broken out by program as well, but that's less common. It's more about how much does this program cost? What are the costs involved in it, including indirect costs like your phones or whatever it is for your particular program. And then your personnel, your program manager. Again, maybe 20% of your executive director's time goes towards this program. I don't know, but all of those should be broken down. This is definitely a place where the more details, I don't want to say always, but basically the more details, the better. And then this should fit into your organization budget. For example, program 1 plus program 2 plus admin and fundraising should total the organization budget. If your program budget is larger than your annual budget, that's a red flag. Like, why would that be the case? Now, if you said this is built for 2 years, like if you're explaining it in there, that is completely like, you can have that. But for the most part, 95% of the time, your program budgets, along with your administration and fundraising should equal your organization budget. It's fairly simple. Okay, and this is our last finance. So keep bearing with me until we can, and then we can take a pause for some questions. So, but this one's a big one. When I said that this is the annual budget's your most important financial document, I would say it possibly ties with last year's financials. So last year's financials can sometimes be confusing to people because we have a balance sheet, a profit and loss statement, and an audit if your organization does an audit. So for the balance sheet, that is a document that gives an example of all of your assets on one particular day. So for example, if you buy a car for cash and before you buy that car, it may look really good, like you have a ton of money in the bank. Right after you buy that car and take out $5,000 or whatever it is for the used car, you suddenly don't have as much in the bank. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a snapshot from one day. It should include all of your assets. So there's cash assets like your savings, your organization's savings, the cash in the bank for your bank account, your regular checking account, and then also your fixed assets. So maybe you own a building, maybe you own a car now, maybe you, usually it's equipment, buildings, vehicles, so computers and things like that, but things that could be turned into cash, but are not readily available. If you had a $20,000 shortfall, you're not going to likely sell your building. So that's the balance sheet. The profit and loss, I'm going to date myself a bit here, but it's like your checkbook. It is a record of everything that comes in during the year and goes out during the year. So these categories in the profit and loss should line up similar, basically, ideally be exactly the same as your annual budget. You have your foundation grants, you have corporations, et cetera, et cetera. So on the P&L side, I don't know how much you started with. You might have started with $500,000. You might have started with $10. I don't know, but I can see how much you brought in and how much you spent in the 12-month period. And again, this should have dates so we know that, and ideally like January 1st. So because 2021 means different things to different people. It could be starting July 1st. It could be, it's just easier if you date it and be as specific as possible on these sorts of statements. So balance sheet, profit and loss together make your financials, your year-end financials. Very rarely does a funder want one of these. They want both because they understand that both tell a picture of how healthy financially your organization is. And then second, on the past year's financials, organizations, particularly organizations with a $500,000 or more annual budget, should have an audit. Various funders, some funders will only look at organizations that have an audit. We have a funder here in Colorado that you can ask for up to $25,000 if you don't have an audit, but you could ask for $200,000 or more if you do. So an audit is best practice because someone outside your organization is looking at your finances. On the balance sheet and P&L, I could produce that if I'm the executive director. I pull it from QuickBooks or whatever service you're using, and there it is. And so you only have one set of eyes. With an audit, a financial audit, you have a auditing company look at your books, make sure they all look good, ask questions, look at, there's usually something that they have questions on. And then now you have a financial audit and they say, this organization's in good standing. There's all sorts of items that are in there, including your balance sheet and P&L, but it's an audited version. So a financial audit often will be, and we'll talk about this in a minute, will be done within the first 6 months of the next fiscal year. So like at this time right now in April of 2022, if a funder wanted last year's financials and you have an audit, I would probably send the 2021 balance sheet and profit and P&L, assuming a January 1st fiscal year. So I'd send the balance sheet and P&L for 2021, and then the audit would probably be the 2020 audit. If you already have your 2021 audit done and you have a January 1st fiscal year, you should pat yourself on the back because that's impressive. So those are the 3 different parts of last year's financials. So before we move on, I wanted to take a pause and see if there's any questions. Stephen, are there any that are coming up on chat or anything we should talk about?
Yeah, there were a couple that were timely on this topic, Megan, might be good to get to. Joyce was wondering if you perhaps have too much net profit, could that be maybe a red flag to potential funders if in that statement there's like, oh, wow, that's a lot, maybe we don't need to fund them? What do you think of that?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think that's why you have your balance sheet and your P&L, because if, let's say, like we saw some groups that brought in more money than they ever had in 2020 because of PPP loans and different things. And so, and there was need as well, but they saw bigger revenue, and some of that they didn't know would happen. Nobody knew what would happen in March and April of 2020. So yes, that can be a red flag. What I would say though, is you can explain it. So perhaps you brought in $200,000 over on $1 million budget. That's 20%. That's a lot. But if you're saying, if you're explained that we are raising money for this thing, or it shows up in this P&L, but next year we're spending it, this was all a plan, because a lot of times you're raising money 3 months or 6 months before you're spending it. That doesn't always work perfectly with a 12-month P&L. So you might have $200,000 in profit one year, but you know what you're doing with it the next year. So I would just explain that in the explanation of finances, which we're going to talk about. But that's a great question.
One more, Megan, if it's okay before you go on, since it's on this. Kat was wondering, what if you maybe have the opposite problem where you suddenly lost a big chunk of funding, like in the last year, like maybe you lost all your government funding last year and there's a big drop. How would you recommend addressing maybe that sudden change in your financials?
Definitely. So I mean, again, there's most funders will give you a place to explain your finances if there's something wonky. So that's where I would say that. I also, so if your budget's a lot smaller or your P&L is a lot smaller than the budget projections, like we saw that too in 2020, a lot of people changed their budget in, like if they were at a fiscal year of January 1st, they'd have a different budget by July 1st for sure. So I mean, you explain it. You can also, if you have plenty of money in the bank, like I have a client right now who's strategically using some of their savings because they have a lot of savings in the bank. So if you have plenty of savings to offset that loss, you're okay. But a funder would want to see that you cut back. So if you see a major loss, you should also have reduced expenses. And sometimes that means making difficult choices. Obviously, if you have a huge loss in December and you didn't count on it, again, just explain it and say, we're going into 2022 with a much smaller budget. We didn't know that the state of Wisconsin would suddenly not fund early childhood. I'm making up this example. So just explain it. But again, we're responsible for reducing our expenses along with revenues.
Cool. Let's keep trucking. I think there's some that are going to get answered in the rest of the session, but we'll come back to them if not.
Sounds perfect. It's almost Friday, guys. And also, I was thinking about how it's the year of the tiger. We're in Aries season. I hope you all are channeling your inner warriors. And if your tiger right now is resting and not ready to pounce, but needs to rest right now, that's great too. Because grant attachments are just full of energy. So here we go. All right, year-to-date financials. This is basically the same as the end of year finances, but it's just this year. So right now, again, it's just so easy to use a January 1st fiscal year. So that's what I'm talking about. They're generally provided quarterly. You don't need to provide them to funders each month. You can if there's some reason that you want to, but for the most part, they're provided quarterly. For where we are at the very beginning of April 2022, and assuming January 1st fiscal year, you should be working on your first quarter finances. You probably don't have them done yet. Some people do, but I wouldn't expect that. Again, it's the balance sheet and profit and loss. And on these year-to-date finances, there's a little more flexibility for some of those big changes. So maybe right now, you have a negative balance. Your expenses are $50,000 more than your revenues because you're spending money for an event that's going to happen in May. And then at the end of the second quarter fiscal year, or excuse me, the second quarter of the fiscal year, you're expecting that your revenues would be much higher. Sometimes you might need to explain this, but for the most part, funders understand that quarters vary and every organization has their own schedule. A lot of times the fourth quarter of the year is very strong for organizations because of end of year giving. But again, every group is different. Okay, 990 and major donor list. Every US nonprofit must file this form with the IRS. Foundations sometimes ask for it as an attachment. It can be very long. I'm sure some of you have seen. And they're also available on GuideStar, but certain funders like to see your 990, even though they are completely available to any person, as long as you can use the internet. So then there's also the major donor list. Some funders like to see this. They want to see where you're getting your money from. Where are those big pockets of money coming from? You as an organization decide what amount is a major gift to you. It could be 1,000, it could be 5,000, 500, that is completely up to you. And then most nonprofits include every funding source. So you might say, City of Denver gave us $77,000 or whatever, but some only do corporations, foundations, and individuals and not government contracts. So that is up to you. Also, just so you know, best practice would be to have donor 1 for $10,000, donor 2 for $8,000. You don't need to name the individual donors, but the corporations and foundations you usually do. So you say Bloomerang for $5,000, Amazon for $20,000, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that would be on a list for major donors. And this is an annual thing. So at this point, it would be January 1st fiscal year, you have your 2021 major donor list. Now, when should you update attachments? So for the non-financial attachments, a lot of funders like to see the 501c3 letter dated within the last 5 years. Some don't care, they're fine with the original one. Again, like I said, it's free, it's easy to get it. Board of directors list is annually or when changes are made. So maybe your board is all elected in May. So then you'd want to change your board of directors list then. Key staff list, same thing, update annually or when changes are made. I have a group that they have a new executive director in October. We did all their updating of the key staff list then. We didn't need to make any changes in January, February because there hadn't been any major changes because they just made big changes. So this is annually or when changes are needed. Financial attachments. The annual budget should be updated annually. I guess that's saying annually 2 seconds right in a row, but that's life. Updated annually, and ideally we have this budget at least 2 months before the new budget year. Funders are often looking at 3 and 6 months out. And so if I'm applying for grants in November and you have a January 1st fiscal year, they want to see what you're going to do in 2022 if it's November 2021. They're not really concerned about what you want to do for the remainder of the year. They want to look at your finances and such, but they want to see what are you doing in 2022. Program budgets, again, update annually. And last year's financials, balance sheet and Pnl should be updated within 30 days of the fiscal year ends. So you should have those ready by February 1st for a January 1st fiscal year. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the audit is within 6 months of the fiscal year. We sometimes see audits later than that and 990s later than that. But if it's November of 2021 and you don't have your 2020 audit and 990 done, you should work on getting that done quicker. So that's just best practice, 6 months. Year-to-date financials within 30 days of the quarter's end. So again, like considering it's April 7th today, you may not have your first quarter financials done. I wouldn't probably, but usually by the middle of the month and definitely by the end. So for a May 1st deadline, you should have those first quarter financials complete. The 990, same thing, like I said, the audit is within 6 months of the fiscal year. And then the major donor list is generally done annually. So it's the major donors for the last year. So now we get into a little more fun topic, less common and optional attachments. So on the non-financial side, some funders love to see pictures, videos, including YouTube links are very big, especially with, just certain funders really like to see the videos and the YouTube links. Letters of support. So these would come from whoever might be someone that your organization engages with. Maybe it's a founder that said, this is a great group. I no longer work with them, but they're doing amazing things. And I'm so excited to see where they are 30 years from when I started them. Maybe it's the mayor saying, this nonprofit is doing amazing work in Hoover, Alabama, and we want to, I'm putting my name behind this. This is some really wonderful, it's a wonderful group. So, so that's what letters of support are. Annual report is almost always optional, but your organization might do a 20-page annual report. They might do a 2-page snapshot with infographics. That's up to you, but if you have it, it can't hurt. It generally, I can't imagine it hurting a grant. And then evaluation results. This is a great one that if your organization does some really robust evaluations, this can really make your group stand apart. Because if you have a document, you might talk about your evaluations for sure in the grant, but if you have something like, here's an example of the survey we do, here's the results from the last 2 years, here's this, that, I mean, I've seen some of these that are 15 to 20 pages, but it's showing like we are doing results, we're doing evaluations, we're getting results. I mean, that's incredibly powerful to funders. They love data. So if you have something like this, I would definitely include it. And with these optional attachments, know that they truly are optional. Like, don't feel like, oh, I have to fill this space, or here's an optional question. Don't feel that you have to put anything in there. This is an opportunity for you to make your case even more to the funder. So if you think it's going to help, put it in. Something like a letter of support with the mayor of Hoover, Alabama might help for a funder right there in that town, but perhaps you're going to a neighboring town. Maybe that's not the letter of support you want to include. So know your audience. Perhaps it's a conservative versus progressive funder, like the same. It's kind of like a resume and cover letter. This part is where you can separate out yourself, and it should be individualized for the funder. The same picture, maybe one funder only funds people over 50. Well, I wouldn't include a picture of a kid in that one. But if you have an awesome picture of an older adult who's 55 receiving services from your organization, absolutely include it. So know the audience, know the funder, and put things in here that help you and help tell your story. But if there's nothing and you leave it blank, it's not going to hurt you at all. So this is an opportunity to give a little more when it makes sense. On the financial attachments that are optional or less common, we talked a little bit about it in the questions, but an explanation of your finances. If there is something in your finances that you think this is going to get in the way, this doesn't look great, then explain it. They're going to have the question whether you explain it or not, and it's better to be upfront. So perhaps you do have a major loss, and you can say we projected this, or we didn't know we have a major loss because the 3 ballets we were going to put on in 2020, guess what? Those didn't happen. I mean, I was writing grants for arts groups reports where, I mean, the funders understood. They said, just put in whatever happened to you. You don't have to have lots of results. We know that you all are hurting. We care about you. Put whatever you need to put into the report to tell the story. So they understand, and they understand that life doesn't always go to plan, particularly all of us who've survived the last couple of years. So just have that there. If there's not a place, sometimes some funders have, here's a place where you can explain your finances. If they don't have that and it's a big deal, I would put it after your last year's finances or whatever it is that you think looks weird, and put an explanation right there. Have it signed by your board treasurer or executive director or somebody, just saying, we know this looks weird. Here's why. Here's, if you have questions, here's my number or whatever. So just if you have a question on it, they're going to have a question on it. Okay, here we go with something a little, I don't know. I think optional attachments are really fun. I mean, for attachments. And then trends in attachments. This is something that we're seeing here in Colorado more and more, nationally as well. But one thing that we're seeing more is diversity, equity, and inclusion statements versus non-discrimination policies. Most nonprofits, other entities as well, governments, et cetera, have a non-discrimination policy saying we will not discriminate based on these protected categories, et cetera, et cetera. A DEI statement, diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, is a little more, it's not we won't discriminate, we want you to bring, I saw some really great ones that are in the for-profit space. We want you to bring your whole self to work. We know that diverse teams are what leads to the best result, are going to bring in the most sales for X company, et cetera. So that's not as relevant to a nonprofit, but these statements are, you can make it relevant to your mission. So we have a funder here in Denver that says they want Denver to be the most racially equitable city in the country. So that's putting a pretty strong standpoint out there. And so basically these are not something that are required yet. We definitely see lots and lots of questions about how is your group being as equitable as possible? How are they in the justice space? This, that, and the other. We're not seeing it as an attachment yet, but it is. We're seeing a little bit of it. So it's not required yet, but we think this could be more and more important. So I wanted to mention it as a potential trend in attachments. And so that basically wraps up the content of our webinar today. If you have any questions, Stephen can bring them forth, definitely. But I really wanted to say, and we have a little bit more we want to talk about too, but before that, we wanted to get into questions and answers. Attachments are really important. The writing, people talk about, oh, writing and think it's, all about writing. Anyone who does grant writing knows it's so much about getting the materials you need and putting them together to put together this amazing document that then a funder looks at and thinks, great, I'm going to fund that. So just attachments are really important. I would say that's the key lesson I'd like you to know.
Megan, that was awesome. Thank you. I learned a lot because, like I said, this is one we've covered very much at all. So what a great overview, and love to see that shift towards the DEI. I love that too. So thank you. We got a lot of questions, probably more questions than we have time for. But I've been kind of circling some good ones here. If we don't get to your question, we'll have Megan's contact info for sure. I promise I'm not playing favorites. And we will be sending out the recording as well as the slides later on this afternoon. And those will be shareable or forwardable, if that's the right word. So you'll be able to share that with a friend or a colleague if you want to. So yeah, let's do questions. If you haven't asked a question, do so now. We'll try to get to as many as I said, before. Megan, a few people were asking about the audits and specifically reviews. Is a review equivalent to an audit? Is that something you can do in lieu of an audit, or is that just no replacement for a full-on kind of traditional audit? Have you seen kinds of reviews be acceptable to those funders?
A financial review is better than nothing. So it's better than the Pnl and Balance Sheet. The full audit is definitely recommended. Again, if you have an annual budget of $500,000 or more. If you're smaller and still doing one, that's great. There's just a cost involved. I think what I've heard, and I don't know the current cost in 2022, and it depends if you're in California or Georgia, I'm sure. But I've seen like financial reviews might cost $5,000 and a full audit's more like $20,000. So if that's something your board would stomach and it's a step, I think it's definitely worth it. It's just the full audit is definitely what some funders want to see.
And do you find that $500K a year is kind of a nice line to where if you're over, definitely need that audit, or is there any organization that's too small to do an audit?
That's a great question. I think I'd transfer that to a CPA, but I think that if it's a great way to make sure you're doing your books and everything the right way. So what we have seen is that sometimes maybe a group will do an audit once every 3 years. So there's something like that where maybe you can't stomach it in your budget every year, but maybe you do it every 3 years and you can show that. And again, that's better than nothing. So yeah, it used to be 250 and higher. I'd say it's 500,000 and higher, but definitely recommended. And I do think they're cheaper if you have a $10 million YMCA you're running, that's a lot more complex than a $200,000 food bank. So I'm not a CPA, but I think there is some differences in cost depending on how big your organization is.
Yeah, and also maybe a requirement if you're a certain size, right? So yeah, check with those financial people. Very good. So Megan, we've done sessions before on reporting, kind of visuals, charts versus text. What's your take on visualizing some of this stuff in those attachments? Do you think it's always necessary to have really nice looking pie charts and line and bar graphs and things like that, or laying out just the pure financials. What have you seen work there? Maybe you have access to a graphic designer, perhaps.
Right. No, that's a great question. I mean, sometimes in the annual report, you have some really pretty pie charts and such, but with the finances, they're looking at literally like numbers usually. And a spreadsheet, most people, again, use something they can pull out from a database like QuickBooks. But I think if it helps tell your story, absolutely. So that might be something in an optional attachment, or I generally, most funders are looking for the numbers. But again, if you, I'm just thinking about it, but if it's something where you can tell your story a little bit more with a picture or something, I don't think it can hurt.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it's not in lieu of. You need to have those basics. And if it's really, we've definitely worked with some people that's very difficult for them to say, this is how much we're going to spend on this. This is how much we're going to spend on that. And the reality is we just have to do it. And so if it's working with a board member or working with someone else that will help you really project out a year, people understand that things get changed, but we all have to have those annual projections and finances.
Makes sense. They need the raw numbers at the end of the day. Cool. Here's an anonymous question, which I really love. All these ideas, I assume a lot of organizations are going to have to collect these things from different departments, people. Any tips for just like wrangling all that, maybe getting buy-in from your coworkers, explaining the importance? Like, is that something, I assume maybe you've helped some clients with that, or people have experienced before?
Absolutely. And I meant to say at the beginning, because it is huge, keep a folder in whatever system you're using, your desktop, Google, whatever it is, of all the attachments. And I would actually include 2 subfolders within there, common attachments, and then here's the pile of everything else, because maybe you had to create a list of your top 10 funders for one funder. And then you may never need that again, but you may. So it's better to just keep anything that you've done that hard work on. And we even keep old attachments. We'll keep 2021 is in one folder, 2020 is another, because maybe you have to do something that you did 3 years ago and you want an example so that you can use the current numbers, but now you have a format to put them in. So keep everything in just like you would your language, keep it in some sort of folder, keep it up to date. And then as far as wrangling attachments, this is an excellent question. So it depends if it's internal or external. If you're working on a grant with partners and other organizations where you need not just letters of support, but maybe a budget or something like that, or bios or that kind of thing, I would tell them a month before, like, this is the deadline, I need to gather this stuff. If you only just found out about the funding 2 weeks, but give them deadlines that are actually before the real deadline and say, we need this, this, that, and the other. And I would do that with internal staff as well. This grant is due Friday when really it's due Monday. I don't advise lying for the most part, but people are often very deadline driven, and you need these materials so that if nothing else, like we tell clients all the time, we need time to review it, because if it doesn't look good, we want you to make this small edit or do this. Sometimes you can't change something, but ideally you can say, look, this is not as beautiful as it could be, or this is not telling the right story with these finances. Your program budget says Steven's salaries $80,000 and that's the whole program budget. That's a problem. So anyway, I would do pretend deadlines at least a week in advance. That's something we do.
I love it. I love the idea of the folders and just having that ongoing process of storage. That seems really key to avoid any of those potential wrangling situations. Okay, we got a lot of questions about the listing of people, Megan. So here's one from Lisa about the board list. So you mentioned that funders might want to ask for their affiliations. Is that where the board members work and like the other things they do? Just to clarify, what have you seen work like? What do you want to list about the boards in terms of where they work and what they're affiliated with?
Absolutely. So usually this is your job title. I'm Steven. I don't know your job title. I work for Bloomerang. And if you need more information, it might be like what that kind of group is, or what, like if it's lawyer, blah, blah, people know what a lawyer is. So you can get into more details. It honestly depends on the funder. Sometimes a funder may want to know, why is this person on your board? And you could say, Steven works at Bloomerang, but the reason he has 4 cats and he just loves cats, and it's a cat organization, so you can definitely be more personal. You can talk about, this is your opportunity with board, and then especially with key staff, to talk about the lived experience that a lot of funders are looking for. So Steven grew up in a homeless shelter, blah, blah, blah. I'm making this up again. Those are the kinds of detail, or this person got out of jail 6 months ago, and we want that perspective on our board. So more doesn't hurt at all. But basically it's job title, organization that they work for. If you've got somebody who doesn't work, sometimes you say retired. I've seen a lot of community volunteers, people who don't have a job title and such. So there's ways to do it. But basically it's job title, organization that they work at, and then like we said, those terms. But if you want to make it personal, there's nothing wrong with that.
I love that idea of kind of contextualizing their bio or CV or just life history to like your mission. That seems like that would be really powerful. So I love that tip too. So for key staff, Kathy was wondering, let's say you've got a big staff and you're applying for an application that maybe is going to a specific project. Would you only list the staff part of that project, or would you want to list the staff of the whole organization? Like, is there a point in which you're too big to list everybody? I guess it's kind of the overarching question. What do you think?
I think that's a great question, Kathy. Sometimes on something like that, we have a really large organization. I would always have the ED or CEO. You might have a couple high level, like your CFO is almost always involved in this kind of thing if it's big enough. So that is a great question. So your key staff list may not look the same for every single funder if you're large like that. For some people, you're really small, it's not a big deal. But a lot of times in something like that, they have questions in the grant about bios and why is Steven the best person to do this, or what's their background. So yes, I would tailor it. And you might include, if it's a program for a specific library within the entire library system, you might include that this is the leader of the African American library, blah, 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 because this is the funding that you're requesting. You might not include that person who's a program director on an overall big grant to the entire state, but because you're asking for $100,000 specifically for the African American library, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Very cool. Here's one. It's not a question, but I wonder if there's a lot of people in this boat. If you're kind of a new organization, maybe it's your first or second year, and you don't have that historical information, audit, there's no financials. What about maybe those new folks, those startup folks? What have you seen work there? When it comes to supplying some of that additional information? Is it okay that it doesn't exist and just say that, or what do you think?
Yes, definitely. And even if like maybe you started in July of last year, so you have a 6-month finances or something, you could say that. We have some funders that they're only interested if you have 3 years of finances. So you got to know the funder. But absolutely, everybody was new once, right? Everybody's a new baby at some point. And so it might be something where you don't have a year's worth of finances, but here's a letter from your bank saying, these people you already have this much in the bank. I don't know what it is, but I would ask the funder and say, look, we're new. We started because of this, and we don't have this stuff. Is there something we can do in lieu of it? And it may be a board treasurer note saying, they're in good standing, they're doing really great, but yes, we don't have a year's worth of finances or something. So that's a great question.
Nice, I love it. Here's from Sarah. If there isn't a place on the application to like explain some of these things we talked about, like we're new or we lost a huge chunk of funding last year, should you just offer that up in a place that makes sense? Or, I guess, if it's not asked for, should you still provide it? It seems like yes, if maybe there is something perhaps odd or something that would require an explanation. And if so, where would you put that, Megan? Would you just put it like with that thing that is showing that weird extenuating circumstance? What do you think?
Yeah, so, and then the last question too, this would be something where I would have a conversation with the funder first. A lot more and more funders are very open to calls. We have some funders in Colorado that will not accept an application unless you've actually talked to a program officer. So, I mean, the reality is this is only a snapshot of your organization. There's only so much you can provide in an entire grant. And so, yes, like I mentioned before on the budget, I would maybe have an explanation on the second page of why you're doing this, that, or the other. But if it's something pretty, something like this is a group that's been 50 years, we've been in the ballet, we've always been doing this, that, or the other, and we have this huge loss, and it's really like, we didn't expect this, and we think it's one time. I would have a phone call because, especially with longtime funders, they want to know how successful your group is, what's getting in the way of your group. And then if you're a new organization getting started, having a conversation, you're selling yourself, talk about what it is that you do. And then ask them say, here's the deal. We have 6 months of finances. Will that be okay? And they may say, sure, whatever. It's great. This other organization is vouching for you. We think you're doing great. Some funders have pretty strict lines. You need to have 2 years of finances in the bank. So good luck. Go get your individual donors set up and work on that part. And we'll talk to you in 2 years. So it depends on the funder. But again, having phone conversations and in person or Zoom or whatever, it can't hurt.
Talking to funder solves a lot of problems, it seems like. That's awesome. I love it. Megan. Dang, we've only got about 2 minutes left, and I want to give you the last word. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but how can people get a hold of you all and Nonprofit Navigators, which are really awesome, by the way? They got a great team over there. I want to give you the last word, Megan, how people can reach out and take advantage of all the cool things you got going.
Well, thank you, Stephen. So thank you all. These are wonderful questions. If you have more questions, we have a free download available on the webinar, 10 best practices and attachments. Basically, most of what I said on this webinar. So you're welcome to access that. And then if you're interested, between now and April 15th, you can request a grant attachment review with either package 1 is the board list and key staff for $100. Package 2 is your financials, organization budget, balance sheet, and P&L, and then your major donor list for $250. So we also do ongoing grant writing with a lot of different clients, particularly in Colorado and Alabama. We do foundation searches for organizations nationally. Maybe you need to see what other funders are out there. Maybe it's been a couple of years since you've looked and that sort of thing. So basically we have all sorts of services. If you just want to get the download and move forward, that's wonderful too. If you have any questions for me or you want to reach out, my email's right there. Again, it's Megan Ferry. I thank you guys so much for your time today. I hope you have wonderful springs and get out there and smell the flowers.
Well, thank you, Megan. This was really a treat to have you and a lot of really good info. So thanks for doing this and your team for giving you time to do this as well. It was a fun one for sure. And thanks to all of you. I'm sure you're real busy. So to see a full room, people taking time out of their schedule to be here is always awesome, and love to see all the conversation that you're having with each other. So reach out to Megan for sure. Love those services you're offering. Those are really nice. So hopefully you'll get some people doing that. We've got a great webinar coming up next Thursday, 1 week from today, exactly 1 week to the minute. My good buddy Brian Saber is going to talk about how to get your board to fundraise. Always love that topic, right? And he is my buddy. I actually just saw him at this conference I'm at and gave him a big hug this morning. And he gave a workshop in this room on this topic. So I know it's going to be a good session because I've heard it. So join us. If you're here, you will get an invite to that. register anyway, even if you know you can't make it, because we'll send you the recording. We won't even notice necessarily that you aren't there. You won't take up anybody's spot. I mean, we will definitely miss you, but you won't take up anybody's spot if you don't show up live. So check that out. You'll get an invite to that on Monday, and you'll also get today's recording and slides later on today. So just look for an email from us at Bloomerang with all those goodies. Reach out to Megan, and I hope we'll see you again on another Bloomerang session. So we'll call it a day there. Have a good rest of your Thursday. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy out there. We need all of you doing all your good work, and we will talk to you again soon. Bye now.
Guys, bye.
See ya.